This is the All Things Risk podcast, big picture risk reflection episode for 2020-2021 with our guest, Daniel Wagner. Welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. I'm Ben Catania, your host. This is the show where we use the lenses of risk and uncertainty to understand ourselves and our world a little bit better. Let's get right into it. For the past 3 years, Daniel Wagner and I have taken this time to reflect backwards and forwards on the world from a big picture risk perspective. And this is the episode for that, for 2020 and 2021. And of course, there's plenty to discuss from COVID, the United States, the Middle East, Brexit, and what 2020's lessons for risk management are. If you are new to Daniel, he is a world-acclaimed expert on geopolitical risk, and he's been a frequent guest on the show. Word of warning, this episode was recorded just before Christmas in a busy household. There's a little bit of background noise at times and a very well-timed doorbell. This, however, doesn't detract or interfere from the conversation and from the listening experience, but I thought I'd give you a little warning. So let's get right into it. Our big picture for 2020-2021 reflection episode with Daniel Wagner. Enjoy. Daniel, welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on as always. However, this may be the last one of these for a little while as you look towards pastures new. So looking forward to this.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. It's always a pleasure, and I really appreciate our collaboration over the past year. I hope people have benefited from it. And yes, I do expect to be heading down a new path after the new year, and I'll announce that when the time comes.
Fantastic. So this is, I think, the third time we've done one of these reflecting backwards and forwards type of episodes, and they're always interesting and lots of fun, and there's lots to talk about as usual. And let's start with what everyone has been dealing with over the course of the last several months, COVID. But as of the time of our recording, we have a new strain of this disease, which we've talked about that earlier in the year, new strains, mutations, etc. So maybe not that surprising, but that has thrown the world into a bit of an additional set of measures and a little bit more panic as flights to and from the UK in many instances have been cancelled, for instance. And in the meantime, since we've last spoken as well, vaccines have been announced and plans to roll out vaccines have been announced. So there's sort of twin and maybe dissonant realities here. What are some of your reflections about what we can expect over the coming 12 months or so around COVID? Sure.
So again, neither you nor I are virologists or epidemiologists, but we just consume information like so many other people. I do think it's worth reflecting on the likely value of these vaccines in the context of the fact that there is so relatively little information about how people will react to this vaccine over the long term, whether it will remain effective, whether it will combat against new strains, et cetera. And I think we risk some over-reliance on these vaccines, as magnificent a scientific accomplishment as they are in an incredibly short period of time. I think for me, the real issue is not whether the vaccines are going to work. It's really more of a question of what about all the billions of people who aren't going to be getting it next year? And that says to me that we're really not facing any significant change in the landscape that most of us will have to be confronting on a daily basis vis-a-vis this disease. I think we're going to be wearing masks and washing our hands incessantly for a very long time to come. There is a movement that was started by the WHO, in conjunction with some non-government organizations earlier this year, called COVAX. And that really is an issue of raising money so that the less developed, the poorer countries of the world can have access to some of these vaccines because they don't have the money to purchase it themselves. And the WHO, in conjunction with these organizations, has raised something like $2.5 billion so far. They need another $4.5 billion to make it really effective for so many of the world's people. There are also some other initiatives that are underway, such as between France and Canada, which are trying to establish a mechanism for distribution of their own vaccine supplies and future acquisitions. India is working in conjunction with the Gates Foundation to figure out how to tackle distribution in India and beyond. And that all said, it really would have been great if the world's richest nations, with the most resources and money, could have come together earlier this year to figure out how all of this should happen with a joint effort. Of course, that didn't happen. Everybody's preoccupied with what's going on in their own countries. And of course, we're dealing with an incredible time frame that all of this stuff has happened in the past year. So in a perfect world, there might have been some lottery systems set up, or there might have been more of a combined effort by G20 nations, for example, to come up with some sort of a mechanism. I guess we're just going to have to work with what we've got. Once the majority of the world's richest nations' occupants have been inoculated, I think what's going to happen is there will be some plan set up to distribute the remainder that they're obviously not going to use. So a lot of unknowns, but I don't foresee, and I think some other people who are more knowledgeable than I don't foresee that there is likely to be much changing in terms of the world's COVID protocols until probably 2 to 3 years from now.
When you think about how it's cliche, we live in an interconnected world, et cetera, but it's also true. And when you think about countries like India that you mentioned, places like Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, Asia, and you have worked in this space for a long time, the constraints associated with any form of rollout of anything with regard to infrastructure, lack of roads and rail and ports and refrigeration facilities and all of the things that are required, 2 to 3 years may even be optimistic. We may have lots of COVID hotspots around the world for quite some time. When you think about also, I think we've talked about this polio, the eradication of polio, how long that took. So this may go on. This may be going on for, or may go on for a significant period.
That's a really good point. And I think what it means ultimately is that each of us, individually and then societies collectively, we're going to have to change how we look at each other. I think the real challenge is ultimately going to be how do we collaborate on some of these efforts, but also how do we treat our fellow citizens? I mean, there's a tendency, I can tell you, in the States for people to be very suspicious of one another in terms of, are you a source of potential concern for me? But also it's unleashed a torrent of goodwill among many people. And I guess I find myself wondering which is going to win over at the end of the day. I still think there's an incredible culture of silence which pervades vis-a-vis this disease. You can be on an airplane, you can see somebody not wearing a mask properly. 99% of the people won't say a thing. I came back from a domestic trip in the States about a week ago now. And on my flight back, I saw 2 or 3 people. They weren't wearing the right types of mask and they weren't properly wearing it. And nobody said anything until I did. And I don't hesitate to do that because I don't really feel that we have to worry about political correctness in a time where our own health and possibly our lives are at risk. I really just wish that there were more people who would crash through this culture of silence, which continues to pervade America. I don't know how prevalent it is in Canada, the UK, or some of the other places where you're spending time these days. But it just is mystifying to me how just incredibly terrible America's response to this thing has been. I'm hoping that there will be substantive change come January 21st. I'm not sure there's going to be. I think people are already in their habits in this country, and many are simply resistant to change. They're resistant to being told what to do. Then you've got the anti-vaxxer movement, and how do you get people vaccinated even in countries where it's available? Because the polls here show that easily, 25 to 40% of the American population doesn't even intend to get vaccinated. What do you do with that?
Wow. What do you do with that?
Right. Well, it doesn't seem like America is ever going to get to the stage where it's a mandatory thing for the collective benefit. In many other countries, it either already is there or it will be there, and it should be. I mean, we're really, you talk about individual choice. Individual choice is fine when you're the only one being affected by your choice. But when you're not, it really becomes a much bigger issue. And I don't know how, when, or if that's ever going to be tackled here. But it really, this whole response has raised legitimate questions about which is a better type of government in an era of pandemic. And I think some of the more authoritarian type governments would say, well, take a look at what we've done versus all the turmoil that the UKs and the USs are going through. I think you may have your answer.
Indeed. Well, time will only tell, but I agree with you. I think we'll be dealing with this for a significant period. And we may have things like, well, you can't go to, I don't know, Alabama because it's a COVID hotspot. You can't go to some parts of the UK, or even France has a higher anti-vax movement, I think, than even much of the US. So it's not clear how the rollout will proceed, but I think we will have a significant proportion of people who refuse to take the vaccine. And will we have bifurcated populations? That's an interesting question. We're already quite divided in a lot of Western societies anyway, and this may just accelerate that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. We're already going to get to the stage, I think, as soon as maybe even the first half of next year, where we're going to have these COVID passports where people who've been vaccinated and cleared, they have the ability to travel with relative freedom, and the people who don't just don't. Mm-hmm. I don't know what it's going to take to get to some sort of a universal approach to that either. But I can tell you that among the countries that I visited this year, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia, Turkey, they all have protocols for getting on an airplane and what you do when you get there and how do you leave, et cetera. A lot of countries still don't. It's astonishing to me. And we could use as an example, as you mentioned, the recent spike in the UK and this discovery of this new strain, which is making it much more communicable, apparently. What did Europe do? Europe basically shut its borders to UK flights very quickly. Some people think it's an overreaction. Many people do not. Nothing in the U.S., not even any kind of a response. It's just mind-blowing to me. And this is from a, quote, friendly country. Every time I've come back to the U.S. this year from overseas, I mean, nobody took my temperature. Nobody asked me where I've been. It's just mind-blowing.
Well, yes, there's a lot going on, and we will be in this for a significant period of time, as we've stated before. So as we hear about things like the vaccine, I think a note of caution needs to be sung, because it's clear that this will take a long time for us to work out and work through. All right, let's talk a little bit about China, perhaps. And, in the midst of everything that's been going on in the US with the elections, COVID, Brexit in the UK, the CCP has produced its most recent 5-year plan. And maybe some things have been going on in China that we haven't been paying as much attention to as perhaps we ought to. Would be keen to get your thoughts on any of that.
Indeed. I've been in touch with some friends in China in recent days and weeks, and they've got this whole COVID thing pretty much under control. That's not to say that they don't have an occasional outbreak, but they've gotten it down to such a science, if you will, in terms of how they deal with it, that they're concerned about letting anybody else in because that's going to be a potential real source of infection for them, whereas domestic travel there presumably is not such a concern. That all said, I've been reflecting in recent weeks about what we can learn from China. And I think it's so easy for Westerners and Americans, what have you, to simply criticize China. And as we know, much of that criticism is deserved. However, I think we fail collectively to stop and think about what we can learn from how China has risen, not only in the last 3 decades, but even in the last 5 to 10 years. And what they did to get there and how it is that they're continuing to climb and rise despite all the odds, despite economic turmoil, despite COVID, despite opposition to them from around the world. I mean, they're doing a lot of things right. And I'm hoping that the Biden administration and future governments in other Western countries are going to stop and think about this before they simply jump on the bandwagon and criticize China without considering how we might collaborate. My hope with the Biden administration is that there will be more collaboration. I'm under no illusion about what that might entail. Mr. Biden has already said he's not lifting the trade restrictions anytime soon. And as I think we've spoken about before, I don't really anticipate there's going to be much of a wholesale change, certainly not the first year. And of course, if there were to be a wholesale change, it's going to really require both sides to step up and want it and do something about it. But I do think that going forward, there is so much to consider about what we might gain by collaborating rather than just competing. So that all said, I do note that the 14th fifth-year plan is only due to be formally released, I think it is in March. But the orientation around it, as I understand it, is that it's talking about the general well-being of Chinese society. And they're rolling out this idea of 2035 vision. They've got all sorts of different visions, 2030, 2050, et cetera. And this 2035 vision is about modernization within the socialist realm, right? They're talking about modernizing Chinese society in a whole bunch of different areas, making sure that domestic demand is robust and technological innovation, more self-reliance, enhancing various types of market reform, putting the pedal to the metal on advanced manufacturing and infrastructure, making sure the Chinese population is healthy with the robust healthcare, and of course climate change, which China has sort of put itself at the forefront of in recent years. That all said, I think the biggest thing to come out of this is what they're calling dual circulation, wherein you've got this robust domestic demand in China going on and all of the economic impacts that implies with all of the things that they're doing internationally. If you will, it's sort of two wheels spinning at the same time, and they're supposed to intersect for the collective benefit of China and presumably, their member countries, partner countries around the world. I think they've got, a pretty good approach here. This is pretty sensible. It's based on realism. And the Chinese government, once again, seems to be pivoting when and where it needs to. It's seeing some obstacles in the road. And so it's saying, well, here's how we're going to pivot. And here's what I think we need to do to move forward over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And that's what you would expect from them. They've been at this game of these 5-year plans for quite some time. And it seems to me that it's an appropriate orientation for them.
Mm-hmm. And to the point about collaboration versus confrontation, confrontation doesn't seem to have worked for anybody anyway.
Well, it's certainly got more negatives than positives. I'm hoping that the whole competitive stance that the U.S., China, and other countries have been on in especially the last 3 to 4 years is going to be a wake-up call. It's obviously been a wake-up call for China. The question is it going to be a wake-up call for America and the West? And as I've said before, it's all about speaking with one voice. It's all about unilateral as opposed to uniform action. When countries act in unison, they get a different result than if they try to act unilaterally. It's also really about getting America and other countries' house in order. We've got so much dysfunction in America these days on so many levels, certainly at the governmental level. And I just find it's outrage after outrage and embarrassment after embarrassment. And I find myself wondering, when is it going to end? Here again, come January 21st, I'm hoping it's the beginning of a change. And that all remains to be seen. Certainly the partisanship that exists in incredible levels is not likely to change anytime soon until the leaderships of the parties are changed and there's some new blood in there and we don't just keep doing things the old same way. I guess I'm transitioning from China to America.
Yeah, I was about to.
Ready to transition.
I was about to suggest that because I think it is important. And when we spoke last about the results of the U.S. elections, one of the points that you made was about the Republican Party and how many of its members were sort of shamelessly supporting some of the outrageous things that Trump was doing, and that has only gotten worse in the last few weeks. So where do we go from here? What is the damage that has been done post-election in terms of the partisanship and in terms of let's face it, what is it, sort of 75% or 70% of Republicans believe that Biden did not win the election fairly, something along those lines?
Yeah, that's about right. I think what's happened is that the Republican Party is stuck in a big pothole. That pothole is the Trump pothole. And the question is, can they get themselves out of that pothole, or are they just going to flounder in the pothole? And the reason I say that is, pothole implies that there's something lower underneath, and they've reached a new low. I think so many of my countrymen are so surprised that this has happened. That all said, I don't think there's any reason to believe that, A, Trump is not running in 2024 or for 2024, which means we've just got a 2-year break before he's back in the Twitter sphere in a very animated way again, to the extent that he ever leaves, which he may not. I'm fully expecting that there will be an entertainment and media machine behind him by the time 2 years rolls around, and he's going to use some of his $200+ million war chest from supporters since the election to make something like that happen. I mean, apart from a guy like Mitt Romney, I don't see anybody who's likely not only to challenge Trump, but also potentially have an impact on getting the Republicans out of their rut. And let's just assume that they're not going to get out of their rut. Let's just assume that Trump is going to be the nominee again. That means we're set for a rematch between these two players, or two sets of players. And I don't see that ending well. I mean, honestly, can my country really afford to just keep doing nothing but slugging it out among themselves, where these enormous problems that we face are being literally swept under the rug? It took the Congress, 6 months to come up with a second stimulus plan for COVID? Just inexcusable. And seemingly they're not paying a political price for it, because I don't know if you're seeing any reports that I'm not seeing, but I don't see people out in the streets banging pots and pans and demanding action or justice. I think political apathy is sort of feeding upon this bipartisanship, and it's just a sort of a circular cycle that this country's having a very, very difficult time getting out of. It's been decades in the making. I'm not optimistic at all.
No.
I got to tell you, Ben, I don't really see that there's any reason to be. There is a possibility that, Biden becomes some sort of a miracle worker, and all of a sudden the dark clouds part and the sun starts to shine. If that's going to happen, it's probably not going to be in the next 2 years, and it may not be at all during what I hope will be the first 4 years of his tenure. So, that's my basic view.
to your comment about where are the people out in the streets and things like that, not around this stuff, certainly. And while it's created some entertaining memes, I'm talking about this, the stimulus package around, how much $600 can buy you, it really hasn't had much of an effect. And meanwhile, people have been out on the streets about masks and about the election results and all the rest, which does speak to, I think, in some ways, the fatigue around, I suppose, government and COVID and some of the issues that do matter. And if we can transition a little bit to Brexit, I think that part of the reason why the UK is where it is because of that fatigue over Brexit. That it started in 2016 with this referendum that unexpectedly went in favor of the Leave side. And we knew lots of things then that are coming to the fore now. And at the same time, none of that is surprising. And the reason why we are where we are is because of that fatigue. There have been a couple of general elections and nothing has really changed. And we are now over the precipice of what they call a no-deal Brexit, over the cliff edge, in which the UK could leave the EU without a trade deal. And half of its exports go to the EU, and a similar amount of its imports come from the EU. And the economic damage that may be done it could be quite severe.
Yeah, that's my expectation also. Let's not forget, this is a $1 trillion trading relationship between the UK and Europe. It's not inconsequential at all. And you could say, well, why did they leave it to the last minute? I don't think they left it to the last minute to try to sort this thing out. It's just that there's too many issues to address and they've been too far apart. Now, as of today, I understand that they're only maybe 5% apart on where they ultimately need to be to address the fishing rights issue in British waters. And I'm presuming that if they're just 5% apart, they're probably going to get there. Yesterday, they were 35% apart. So that all said, I wouldn't be surprised, and I think I share your view on this, if there will be some sort of a stopgap measure in the coming days just to keep the negotiation process going. But it probably will leave plenty of holes. And I wouldn't be surprised if the negotiations continue well into next year, probably even beyond that. It's just a question of getting a sufficient amount of progress made to be able to continue the negotiation process. And I'm expecting that will get done.
That's right. I agree with that. And I think perhaps the new strain of COVID may be used as a convenient reason to extend that negotiating period. But we'll see over the coming days when this goes out. We may have a clearer answer. But more broadly, I think that this will usher in a relatively dark period for the UK. I think you will see an economic fallout that will not be insignificant, and the forces of nationalism in Scotland and the risk of a resurgence of the Troubles, or a newer form of the Troubles in Ireland, may resurface. And I think the UK is about to enter a period that is not going to be a happy one.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with that also, Ben. I think this is indicative of some of the larger issues that a variety of countries around the world face, that are just lingering issues which have not gotten resolved and which are percolating to the surface. We could even look, for instance, at what's going on in the Western Sahara and how that's bubbled up recently, and the challenges that Ethiopia and Eritrea and Tigray are facing, and other places where, Armenia and Azerbaijan. I mean, these are age-old conflicts that just continue to percolate along, and it's not terribly convenient that they're percolating again at this particular juncture, or maybe there's a reason why they all are happening at the same time, because the world is just in chaos and turmoil. That doesn't say anything good about individual countries' ability to manage this process as well as collectively. I mean, we could enter a situation where we've got, conflict after conflict arising or bubbling up or reaching a peak, and the world's diplomats just end up putting out fire after fire after fire without necessarily accomplishing much in the way of any long-term solutions. Certainly the UK is going to be prone to that sort of thing. Many, many other countries will be as well, which means, so often when we talk, Ben, I don't talk about puppy dogs and rainbows. We end up talking about, some dark topics, or we end up getting dark about them. I really don't see how over the next 1, 2, 3 years, the world is going to be entering a brighter phase. It just seems like we're going to be digging ourselves deeper into a hole. A lot of this stuff, I think, is ultimately self-imposed. Some of it is going to be opportunistic. And the question is, will the world's countries and the world's diplomats be able to do anything meaningful about it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. And it would be, let's put a pin on some of the broader things that we can do, because I would like to cover off a few other parts of the world that we haven't discussed yet. One of the things, however, that we talked about at the beginning of this is the 14th five-year plan, and your comments about things we can learn from China. Where is the scope and the space for leaders and politicians in the UK, the US, the EU to think 5, 10, 15 years down the road? That seems to be a huge gap.
Well, China's got that nailed down, so we don't have to worry about them. I really think that that's really a big part of the problem, Ben, is that so many countries are not really accustomed to thinking beyond the current year or the current election cycle. And they're thinking for 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead that pretty much non-existent. Most of the world's militaries do that, but I don't think that many governments are necessarily oriented to doing that in a meaningful way. So China does it. They devote the resources to it. They're excellent at executing. But even if other countries do want to do it in that way, they're not necessarily very good at executing, and they're not very good at allocating the proper resources to getting these objectives met. And they get caught up in politics or budget shortages or whatever it may be. That, I think, is really the key to making this whole thing work. If you want to have an objective, put the resources in, devote whatever you need to do to get it done and make it happen. Again, something we can certainly learn in spades from China.
Well, thinking about long-term thinking and countries that think long-term, Russia is one we haven't spoken about. And since we last spoke, rather significant cyber attack has occurred, which seems to have emanated from Russia. And I'm just wondering what we can expect with regard to Russia over the coming months, and particularly with regard to Russia-US relations, and any thoughts you may have on the latest cyber attacks.
Well, Russia's not real popular in America right now for obvious reasons. This was really the largest cyber attack on record against the American government. And the shocking thing, truly, is that it went undetected for so many months, since March of this year. Reminds me of 2014 of the Office of Personnel Management, where the breach had gone on for something like a year before it was accidentally detected. How is it that something like that can possibly happen here in 2020 on the verge of 2021? America has reinforced its cybersecurity on a variety of levels, certainly at the governmental level, and yet Russia made this thing look so very easy. It's a reminder of the vulnerabilities that every country has in the cyber arena, and it's really then just a question of how much capacity do you have to protect yourself, and then to what extent are your adversaries too good at what they do to prevent that from happening. In the case of Russia, well, they're very, very good at that tradecraft, and we should not only recognize it, but perhaps try to emulate it. Neither you nor I can know what the U.S. government capabilities are in that regard and what they're going to do in response that may never make the headlines. You can be sure there's something afoot. That all said, Russia is very good, like many other countries, in getting away with what it can get away with. And that's not a crime. If there's nobody there to stop them from doing what it is they intend to do, then who's to blame? Them for doing it, or the people who can't stop them from doing it? In this case, I really just think there are so few excuses, and it really just points to the vulnerabilities that exist even in the most robust cybersecurity network. So where do I see Russia going from here? Well, it's been in a muscle flexing mode for some years now throughout the Middle East and in the cyber arena and others. Putin's very good at what he does, and I think America needs to realize going forward that it doesn't just have a single strong adversary. It has more than one. And unfortunately, I think that means that we're going to not only continue into this Cold War type arena that we're in with China right now, but if we haven't already entered it with Russia, it seems like we sure will soon.
Mm-hmm. Well, that, and with the new administration coming in, obviously the shift will be quite notable, and as you say, new Cold War or continuation, however you interpret it, it's likely to accelerate. And I guess if you are let's say you're an organization, let's say you're a business, and you do business in Russia, or you are potentially a target because maybe you work for the American government or you're working on some sensitive things. I mean, the world of hacking and cyber warfare, as you have written about in the past, that's also only going to accelerate. Is there anything that we can expect in the coming year, you think, that in that space is not, it hasn't been widely spoken about yet?
I think there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the background in the cyber arena that's clandestine, that is confidential, or even top secret that you and I are never going to hear about. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very active world in that arena. And I recently put a post on social media just suggesting that maybe people consider taking a look at my 2017 book called Virtual Terror, mm-hmm. which talks about just how robust that world is in cyber warfare that goes on even at an individual and business level. I don't see anything good happening there either, Ben. I mean, the kind of environment that we're in now is certainly conducive to opportunists and hackers who want to make things worse and take advantage of everybody's vulnerabilities these days. On an individual level, if any of your listeners don't have VPN and they don't regularly update their software and all these types of things, which are standard operating procedure now would be a good time to do it. Probably just a question of time until you're sucked into some of this mess. I'm hopeful that, yet again, this type of wake-up call to the world's governments will result in something meaningful, but it's really just going to be a question of time until we hear about the next mammoth cyber hack. And hopefully none of us will get caught up in it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it may only be a matter of time before all warfare is virtual, or the vast majority of it.
Absolutely. It's already transitioning to that with droids and hypersonic weaponry and wars starting to be conducted by keyboards. Really just a question of time until the armies of the past are no longer utilized to fight wars. It's all going to be done from keyboards with generals in bunkers and that sort of thing. We're already there. Again, I think we've touched in the past on some of the new weaponry that's out in the world. Very, very impressive, also very, very frightening, because once some of this stuff is launched, there's very little in the way of protection that most governments can do something about. The world's biggest and most Sophisticated militaries can do something about it, but even they certainly don't have the kind of effectiveness in combating this stuff that's going to be needed in order to make a difference going forward.
And you can imagine it's already, as you say, it's already happening, but this year has brought home to many the amount of the reliance that we have on our digital networks. So if you can imagine attacks on infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and not being able to get work done, communicate with colleagues, make payments, receive payments, give orders, all of those kinds of things, how paralyzing a well-executed cyber attack could be on any organization. I think that has been brought home in spades this year.
Absolutely right. I mean, if I was a hacker, and for the record, I'm not, I don't have that capability or that inclination. But if I was, you could think about some very basic functions to address that would absolutely cripple organizations and have a profound impact on individuals and society at large. For example, just consider one of the payment networks that's utilized to make money slosh around the world or into people's bank accounts. If you hacked that, you took it over, I mean, can you imagine the chaos that you could sow? I'm just hoping that organizations like that have the type of robust security that many of these government entities apparently do not. But one of the things that they all seem to have in common, and this was certainly illustrated in Ukraine with the Petya attacks from a few years ago. I mean, all you really need to do is get into a single network, a single open source that has access to 60, 80, 90% of the country's companies, and then the game is over. You don't need to have some vast capability to enter thousands, tens of thousands of businesses. All you need is one entry point. That's really very frightening. And then the latest attack on the U.S. government certainly indicates that we here are guilty of relying too much on a single provider of services. And that definitely needs to change because, again, once they're breached, they got the keys to the kingdom.
Right. I want to put a bit of a pin in that one and we can come back to it. But I would like to just finish off our tour of the globe, as it were. We haven't talked about the Middle East. This will be the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring. It'd be great to get some reflections on that and anything that you think is of import in the Middle East, and then maybe beyond. We continue to hear about the same countries and regions and issues, but you have spent some time in Africa and all over the world. We've spent time in Southeast Asia. There are perhaps things going on in other parts of the world that just not quite on our radars, but perhaps should be. But let's start with the Middle East.
Sure. Well, I'm mindful of the recent progress that's been made vis-a-vis Israel and the normalization of relations with an elite handful of Middle Eastern countries that have decided to bury the hatchet with Israel, including Sudan, which is not exactly Middle Eastern, but let's throw them in the pot. I think that that's indicative of the fact that the Middle Eastern governments in general have sort of turned a page and not forgotten the Palestinians, and they shouldn't be forgotten because that's one of those perennial conflicts that just needs to be formally addressed in a meaningful way. Not for lack of trying, of course, but I think no longer will progress in the Middle East be held up by addressing that issue first. And that's the model that I think has prevented so much from happening in the recent past. I wouldn't be surprised, ultimately, if Saudi Arabia joins the club in burying the hatchet with Israel. I note that Netanyahu was several weeks ago in Saudi Arabia breaking bread with MBS. So, I mean, that certainly wasn't an accident. I'm expecting that something meaningful will eventually come of that. once that happens, I do presume that it will, I think all bets are off. And I think there's plenty of opportunity for changing the Middle Eastern landscape at that point. There may already be. And let's see what happens in terms of the degree to which there is some continuity that continues in the Biden administration from some of the meaningful accomplishments that the Trump administration has made in that regard. I'm certainly not hesitant to give them credit where credit is due, and they do deserve some credit for some things. That all said, let's talk for a minute about the 10-year anniversary of the Arab awakening. Of course, all of us are aware that apart from Tunisia, really, so little progress has been made in meaningfully opening up societies and polities, et cetera, throughout the region. I think it was pretty clear after the first 6 or 12 months of the awakening that it was going to have a limited shelf life. And unfortunately, the aspirations of tens or hundreds of millions of people throughout the region has been put on the shelf. That's really sad. And that really also says something about its inability in terms of a phenomenon to be translated into movements elsewhere in the world. You would have thought, for example, that it would have caught much fire in Africa, where they're certainly ripe for political change in so many countries in the continent. What does it say about us collectively that a movement like that, which was so timely and so long in coming, really didn't result in much at the end of the day, unfortunately? And we're so sort of back to square one in so many countries throughout the region from a political perspective. And I'm not optimistic, unfortunately. I think, there's any number of ways to look at it, but it seems to me that as long as the world continues to be preoccupied by COVID and just survival for so many people, I think they're just putting political change on the shelf. That's probably where it's going to stay for the near term.
Yes. Yeah. You use the term Arab awakening. I use the term Arab Spring, which, why do you call it the awakening?
Well, to me, the idea of the spring implied that there was going to be a change in seasons 3 months later. I know that it's supposed to signify, sprouting of new sprouts and then new growth and all that sort of thing. And for a short while it did. I just call it the awakening because it's, if you ask me, the logical conclusion in terms of how people felt at the time of decades of pent-up demand for political change. And it was an awakening. And I do think it remains an awakening. It's just going to be unrealized. There are some opportunities for it to occur. You could even look at Lebanon, for example. You would think after the terrible explosion earlier this year and the many outrages that have occurred under various Lebanese governments that the people would have been really, really motivated to seek substantive political change. And unfortunately, they're just so preoccupied with survival and getting through the day and their declining standard of living that they don't have time for a political movement. They don't have inclination for a political movement. Political movements are either born of extreme desperation or of extreme confidence, right? That they have what it takes to make a transition. And then you see that government sort of passing the buck and doing what they need to try and keep former government ministers from ending up in prison, et cetera, for many of the things that they did. It's just like a broken record, unfortunately. And that happens to be the case in so many countries in the world that you almost start to lose faith.
Yeah, we always end up in these dark places, right? But okay, anywhere else in the world, before we maybe take a step back, is there anything else in the world that you think, we should pay attention to what's happening here? Anything that's not commonly in the headlines that might give us some surprises in the coming year?
You mean in America?
Anywhere in the world, really. Where aren't we thinking about certain things?
Yeah, I think one thing that I get excited about is, as a result of COVID, there's been a rise in entrepreneurialism around the world and self-reliance. And I'm excited about that because that has the potential to unleash so much good in so many ways, in so many places, that I'm, very hopeful that that will, over the long term, result in some meaningful change economically, possibly even politically. You never know how it may transform itself, what it may mean. I'm very optimistic about what that means for unleashing the incredible potential that exists in so many corners of the world.
And time will tell, right? There are all of these things, these unintended consequences, these opportunities that arise that we didn't know existed before. And absolutely, I think some things that we've talked about before, is around some things relate to risk management and how we view risk and uncertainty. And I think one of the things that has happened over the past 9 to 12 months, is that people are really grappling with this concept of uncertainty. You and I live it and breathe it. So it's much more intuitive to people like ourselves. But others, they kind of say, oh, the world is not on this sort of linear path, that things can happen that are out of left field. And in organizations, I think that has given some pause. You mentioned something about over-reliance on, a single provider, single networks. We've gotten to be these sort of hyper-optimizers, both individually perhaps, but certainly in terms of organizations. There's not enough redundancy. There's not enough appreciation for how things could go wrong, and that things could go wrong in ways that we just never anticipated, and that is always ever present. And I think the past year has given us perhaps an opportunity to think about things a little bit differently, and how we think about uncertainty a little bit differently. And I'm wondering, as someone who's also a risk professional, if you have seen that or have any reflections on that around how organizations can look at uncertainty in a little bit of a different way, whether that could be how we interact with the natural world in terms of policymakers, or in terms of how climate change affects our organizations, businesses, lives, anything like that. Have you seen anything that maybe provides a bit of a shift, or if there's an opportunity to think about uncertainty in a different way, better way, because of the last 9 months or so?
Well, the last year has really said to me that it's reinforced my conviction that each of us, individually, in our roles in business, what have you, we are all risk managers. Every time we walk outside the door, we're a risk manager. Question is, how does that transform into something meaningful on a sustained basis? Each of us, I think, has to view our risk management role in our jobs as something that is inherent in the job. And so many organizations are accustomed to, looking another way so that risk management will pick up the risk management mantle. We don't have the luxury of doing that going forward. If COVID has taught us anything, it is that each of us, individually and organizationally, are in it for ourselves in terms of survival and finding a way to transform lemons into lemonade. That's not a new concept, of course. But for those people who think that 2020 was just one rotten annus horribilis, that somehow January 1st is going to come and everything's going to get better, we know that's not the case. What I think this is an invitation for a pivot point for all of us to reflect on what that means for us individually and in business, and then reflect on what it is that we need to do to make sure that we have a defensive posture and that we're forward thinking, and the strategic planning that we will engage in is achievable and executable on a permanent basis going forward. Because the way we work, whether it's from home or now on a limited basis in a physical setting, in a work setting, or whatever changes may have happened over the last year as a result of COVID, again, as we discussed at the beginning, that's not going anywhere. And so none of us have the luxury of presuming that we're going to business as usual anytime soon.
I think that's a good way to wrap things up. We've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that we didn't get a chance to cover you think is necessary for us to touch on before we wrap up?
I think it's important we don't lose perspective, Ben. I mean, it's just so easy to get so frustrated with everything that's going on and say, not again or not another thing. Mm-hmm. If we're, viewing the world, to pick up from the theme we just left off of, if we're viewing the world from that defensive posture and we're just presuming that there's going to be another bump in the road coming along, we're ready for it, man. Mm-hmm. And it really is a mindset that needs to occur. And for those of us that are able to do that, I think we should embrace the near term and the medium term vis-a-vis COVID and all the challenges that it represents. Because if we've made it this long, we've made it through, and now we've got some wind at our back with the vaccines and treatments and all that sort of thing. The rest is all downhill. We've done the tough part, hopefully.
Fair enough. I think that's a good way to wrap things up. And I will thank you very much for spending some time with us yet again, and wish you all the best in your new adventure.
Thanks so much, Ben. It's been a real pleasure, and best wishes to everyone for the new year.
Thanks, Daniel. Bye for now. All right, I hope you all enjoyed that and found it insightful. Give Daniel a follow, and as mentioned, he is heading off for pastures new and likely won't appear on the show for a little while. We wish him all the best. We'll be back very soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.